In the middle of a tense courtroom, Sergeant Rick Doyle lashes out, kicking a quiet black defendant as if he owned the place. But Marcus Hale isn't just any man. He's a former Navy SEAL with a past no one in that room could imagine. Then a single phone call shatters the arrogance in Doyle's eyes and freezes everyone in place. What truth could turn a cop's swagger into silence in seconds? Hit like, share your thoughts, and subscribe. Now let's uncover exactly what happened that day. I'll never forget the first time I saw Marcus Hale. 35, black, built like someone who'd carried more than his share of weight in life. Broad shoulders, strong frame, but he sat in the defendant's chair like a man who'd been told one too many times to stay quiet if you know what's good for you. A plain blue shirt, worn khakis, hands resting calmly on the table. But his eyes stayed low, locked on the grain of the wood. The charge was disturbing the peace at a corner store. On paper, it sounded almost laughable. But in here, the air buzzed with whispers, painting him as dangerous, unpredictable. By the time truth shows up in a small town, the rumor's already taken root and grown into a monster. The heavy courtroom doors banged open. Sergeant Rick Doyle strode in, white, tall, and square-jawed, his uniform pressed sharp enough to cut glass. Every step echoed off the walls. He locked eyes on Marcus and didn't look away. When he passed the defense table, he leaned in just enough for the front row to hear. "Didn't think you'd have the guts to show up," he said, voice dripping with mockery. Marcus didn't move, not even a flicker, just blinked once, slow. Judge Margaret Collins adjusted her glasses and glanced down from the bench. Late 50s, white, her lips pressed into a thin line. She scanned the room like she was taking inventory. Then her gaze lingered on Marcus, cool and unblinking. She didn't need to say a word. The tilt of her head already carried judgment. Rachel Mendez. His public defender leaned closer. "Just let me do the talking," she whispered. Her tone was steady, but her eyes betrayed it. She could feel the tilt of the room, the way it leaned hard against them. Marcus's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "You think they want to hear the truth?" he murmured back. From the press row, Ethan Ward, young, eager, not yet worn down by the grind, was watching more than listening. His pen stilled when he caught something no one else seemed to notice. Marcus's right hand drifted almost without thought to a long, pale scar running along his wrist. His fingers pressed there for a second, then stilled. Ethan wrote just one word in his notebook. Why the side door opened, and Paul Jenkins, the court clerk, stepped in with a stack of files. He was halfway to his desk when his gaze fell on Marcus. His brows shot up, a flicker of recognition flashing before he forced it away. He dropped the files a little too loudly and busied himself with paperwork. Every sound seemed louder than it should have been: the shuffle of shoes, the creak of the bench, the faint hum of the air vent overhead. The tension wasn't just in the air, it was in the way people sat straighter when Marcus moved in, the way their eyes darted to Doyle for cues. And through it all, Marcus Hale sat silent. Not defeated, just waiting. Like a man who knew the weight of the moment and that when it broke, it wouldn't be him on the floor. Doyle cleared his throat and leaned into the microphone as if the entire room existed solely to hear him. When I approached the defendant, he began glancing toward Marcus with a practiced air. He was agitated, belligerent, the kind of man who thinks rules don't apply to him. People like that. You never know when they'll turn violent. The words landed heavy in the room. People like that. No one needed a dictionary to decode it. Marcus sat perfectly still, his hands clasped together, thumbs pressed so tightly they turned white. His gaze stayed fixed on the table, not the man throwing poisoned darts at his character. Rachel was on her feet before Doyle could continue. Objection. Your Honor, there's no evidence my client was violent. This is prejudicial. Judge Collins didn't even glance up from her notes. Overruled. Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line, but she sat back down slowly. For the record, she murmured under her breath, "We're not letting that slide." Doyle went on, embellishing every detail. He spoke of erratic behavior, of a threatening stance, painting Marcus as if he'd stepped straight out of a mugshot. The fact that Marcus had been standing in line to buy coffee never made it into Doyle's version. When he finally stepped down from the stand, he didn't head straight for his seat. He took the long way right past the defense table. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Doyle muttered low enough that only Marcus and Rachel could hear. Marcus didn't move. He breathed in 4 seconds, out 4 seconds. The years had taught him that some battles weren't worth fighting head-on. Not yet. Rachel whispered, "Ignore him." But Doyle couldn't leave it there. As he passed, his boot shot out sharp fast and connected hard with Marcus's shin under the table. The sound wasn't loud, but the reaction was instant. A woman in the second row gasped. "Did he just order?" the bailiff barked, stepping forward. Rachel shot up again. "Your Honor, the arresting officer just assaulted my client in open court." "Counsel," Collins interrupted, her tone like ice. "Sit down or I will clear this courtroom." With respect, Rachel's voice didn't waver. Let the record reflect. "The officer physically struck my client." Collins set her pen down a little too carefully. "The record will reflect whatever I say. It reflects. Now move on." From the press row, Ethan's camera clicked twice in rapid succession. Through his lens, he caught Doyle's smirk and Marcus's stillness, a perfect contrast between arrogance and restraint. His fingers flew over his phone screen, typing beneath the photo "assault." In open court, Marcus's hand drifted to the pale seam of the scar on his wrist before stilling. Not here. Not now. He lifted his head, his eyes locking on Doyle with a calm so sharp it cut deeper than rage. Doyle's grin faltered. Just for a second, he looked like a man who'd heard a noise behind him in a dark alley. Rachel leaned closer to Marcus. "We'll file it. We'll put it on the record properly." Marcus gave the smallest nod. Judge Collins tapped her pen twice, then stood. "We'll take a brief recess," she announced. The benches creaked as the gallery exhaled. Conversations sparked in whispers. Doyle adjusted his sleeve like nothing had happened, but the shift in the room was undeniable. A line had been crossed, one everyone had just seen. And while no one could know it yet, that single moment was about to set something much bigger in motion. The recess lasted all of 10 minutes, but Doyle came back into the courtroom with the swagger of a man who'd already won. He slid into the witness chair again, stretching his legs like it was his living room. As I was saying, he picked up without missing a beat. The defendant was combative from the start. Raised his voice. "Got in my face. People like him." His smirk flicked toward Marcus. "They escalate things. It's what they do." A couple of people in the gallery snorted quietly. One man shook his head, murmuring something to the woman beside him. Rachel shot a look over her shoulder, her eyes warning them to keep their opinions to themselves. She rose again. "Objection. This is character assassination, not fact." "Overruled," Collins said, barely glancing up. Her tone carried the same subtle disdain it had earlier, but now it was more pronounced, less hidden. Rachel didn't sit right away. "Your Honor, I have a witness who can testify. Mr. Hale was assisting an elderly woman at the time this so-called incident occurred." Collins cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Not relevant. This case is about what happened afterward, which my witness can speak to directly." Collins's voice sharpened. "Not relevant." Rachel exhaled through her nose and sat, the frustration radiating from her. Marcus remained still, but the small twitch in his jaw betrayed what he felt. A clerk crossed the courtroom with a stack of files. One slipped from the pile, fluttering down near the defense table. Before anyone else even registered it, Marcus leaned down, scooping it up in one smooth, precise motion, like a reflex drilled into him, not a conscious decision. His movements were quick, but controlled the way someone trained to act under pressure would move. Ethan noticed. His camera lowered just slightly as his eyes narrowed. That wasn't just quick. That was military quick. Doyle noticed too. His lip curled into something between a sneer and a grin. As Marcus straightened, Doyle leaned forward on the witness stand, lowering his voice so it barely carried beyond the table. "Not so tough now, huh?" Marcus met his eyes for half a heartbeat, calm, unblinking. He didn't answer, but his silence was a weight one Doyle couldn't quite shrug off. Ethan's fingers drummed on his notebook. He had been jotting down Doyle's testimony, but now something bothered him. The timeline Doyle was spinning. It didn't match the reports he'd reviewed earlier. And the way Doyle described Marcus's actions, overblown, vague, smelled like fabrication. Ethan leaned to the reporter beside him. "You catch that? That's not what's in the incident log." The other reporter raised an eyebrow but kept typing. Meanwhile, near the back, Paul Jenkins, usually a quiet background presence, slipped out the side door of the courtroom. His steps were brisk, his face tight. Once in the hallway, he pulled out his phone and dialed fast. "Yeah, it's him," Paul said, his voice low but urgent. "I'm telling you, I just saw it." "No, I'm not guessing I know." A pause. "You need to get here. Now." Back inside, Doyle kept talking, twisting details like a knife, each embellishment landing harder than the last. Marcus's posture never changed, but the muscle along his temple ticked. Rachel kept her eyes on her notes, though her pen moved less now she was listening for an opening, a crack in Doyle's story she could pry apart. And Ethan kept glancing between Marcus Doyle and his own scribbles, the pieces starting to shift into place. Somewhere a storm was building. The tension in the courtroom had settled into something heavy and unspoken until the sharp ring of the clerk's desk phone cut through it like a blade. Everyone's heads turned. In a room where every sound had weight, that sudden trill felt almost rude, almost wrong. The clerk, a woman in her 50s with glasses perched low on her nose, picked up the receiver. Superior Court Clerk's Office. She listened for all of 3 seconds, and then her eyes flicked unblinking toward Marcus. Her posture stiffened. Color drained just slightly from her face. "Yes," she said, her voice softer now. "One moment, please." She covered the receiver with her palm and looked directly at Judge Collins. "Your Honor, urgent call. They say it's from the Department of Defense. They're asking for you, by name." That got people's attention. You could feel it like the air shifted in the room. Collins's brows pulled together. The Department of Defense. Her tone was skeptical, almost dismissive. "This is a court proceeding. Tell them they insist it's urgent," the clerk interrupted, which was something you didn't do to Judge Collins. "And they mentioned the defendant by name." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Even Rachel's pen paused mid-note. Collins reached for the phone, her movements slow but deliberate, as if to show everyone she wasn't rattled. She pressed the receiver to her ear. "This is Judge Collins," she said, crisp and authoritative. The courtroom went silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Collins's face stayed composed at first. Then her eyes flickered just barely as the voice on the other end kept speaking. Her hand shifted on the receiver. "You're certain?" she asked, her voice now quieter, almost strained. She glanced quick-sharp at Marcus. He was still sitting perfectly still, but something in the way he held himself now felt different. "Yes," Collins said into the phone. "Yes, I understand." "No, he hasn't." She stopped mid-sentence, lips pressing into a thin line. "I see. We'll accommodate that request." When she hung up, the room waited for an explanation that didn't come right away. Doyle, arms folded, let out a low chuckle like he was humoring a bad joke. "What's next?" he said under his breath. "An alien spaceship outside." Rachel shot him a look sharp enough to cut glass, but he didn't notice or didn't care. Collins stood the authority in her voice, returning full force. "Court will recess. Now." The bailiff blinked. "Your Honor, we still have..." Now she repeated the word, heavier this time. Benches scraped as people stood, some confused, others curious. Ethan leaned toward Rachel. That didn't sound like just any phone call. She didn't answer, eyes still locked on Marcus. At the far end of the room, Paul Jenkins reappeared. He moved toward the door like a man who didn't want attention, phone already in hand. He typed quickly, his thumb hesitating only once before pressing send. On his screen, the message was short. They're on their way. Rumor travels faster than truth inside a courthouse. By the time the recess clock had ticked 5 minutes, whispers were already curling along the hallway like smoke. Did you hear? They say he used to be in the military? The voice came from somewhere near the water cooler, low enough to seem discreet, but loud enough for half the corridor to hear. Heads tilted. Eyes slid toward Marcus, who stood a few feet away, his back against the wall, hands loosely clasped in front of him. Doyle, leaning against a marble column, smirked, as if the hallway were his personal stage. If he's a hero, he drawled just loud enough for the nearest cluster to catch, then I'm the President of the United States. A couple of his buddies chuckled, their laughter sharp and quick, like the snap of a match being lit. Rachel's heels clicked against the floor as she approached Marcus. They're talking about you, she murmured, tilting her head toward the knot of onlookers. Is any of it true? Marcus didn't meet her gaze. His eyes stayed fixed on a point far down the hallway. It's complicated, he said, the words soft but edged like something meant to close the door rather than open it. Rachel studied him for a moment, reading the tension in the set of his jaw. She wanted to press, but before she could, Paul Jenkins appeared at her side. He didn't bother with a greeting, just leaned in enough that his words were for her ears alone. I made a call, he said quietly. His tone carried the weight of something already in motion, something that couldn't be taken back. You'll see. Rachel glanced from him to Marcus, trying to fit the pieces together. What call, she asked, but Paul was already stepping away, pulling his phone from his pocket, as if the conversation had ended before it began. A few feet away, Ethan was crouched over his camera, fingers flying across the screen. He had the photo Doyle's boot, striking Marcus's leg in open court, and now it was on its way to his editor. He could already picture the headline, Deputy Assaults Defendant in Courtroom. The kind of image that demanded attention, the kind that made people stop scrolling. This goes live in minutes, Ethan muttered to himself, thumb hovering over the send button. His pulse was steady, but his jaw was tight. He knew this photo could blow the story wide open, but it could also make things ugly fast. Marcus shifted his weight, glancing down the hallway as if sensing something before anyone else did. A moment later, the glass door at the far end swung open, letting in a slice of afternoon light, and with it a man no one recognized. He wasn't in uniform. Just dark slacks, a pressed shirt, and a jacket that hung a little too neatly on his frame. His eyes swept the hallway, sharp and assessing, until they landed on Marcus. The change was subtle, but undeniable. His posture straightened. His step slowed for half a beat. It wasn't fear, more like recognition, the kind you see between soldiers who've crossed the same ground. Marcus's brow lifted a fraction, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his expression. The man gave the smallest nod, barely there, before turning and slipping into a side corridor, without another word. The entire exchange took less than 3 seconds, but Rachel noticed. So did Ethan. And so did Doyle, though he covered it with another sarcastic grin like the moment had been nothing at all. What was that? Rachel asked under her breath. Marcus exhaled slowly. Nothing you need to worry about. But she could tell it wasn't nothing. His voice had changed, calmer, steadier. Whatever that brief connection was, it had settled something inside him. The hallway seemed to grow tighter, the air heavier. Conversations faltered, replaced by the sound of footsteps echoing off the marble. Somewhere down the hall, a clerk's typewriter clacked an oddly outdated soundtrack to the tension building between these walls. Ethan slipped his phone back into his pocket, his eyes still fixed on Marcus. Your story's about to be everywhere, he said. Marcus didn't reply. He didn't need to. His silence wasn't empty, it was deliberate. The kind that makes people fill it with their own speculation. Doyle, restless with the lull, pushed off the wall and started toward Marcus, his voice dripping with mockery. So Navy SEAL, huh? Or was it just a summer camp where they taught you how to stand still and look tough? Marcus's gaze lifted slow and deliberate until his eyes locked with Doyle's. No words, just that same steady look, the kind that could make a man forget his next insult. The moment stretched taut as a wire. Then the bailiff's voice broke through from the double doors. "Courtroom will reconvene in 5 minutes." Rachel felt her heartbeat pick up. Paul was still off to the side, tapping something into his phone with quick, precise movements. Ethan shifted his weight, glancing toward the entrance like he expected someone important to walk through any second. And Marcus. Marcus just stood there, the calm at the center of a storm no one else could see yet. If there's one thing about Deputy Doyle, it's that he never quits when he thinks he's winning. The recess had barely stretched past 10 minutes when I saw him slip away from the hallway crowd, disappearing through a side door. He wasn't headed for the restroom, I knew that much. Doyle had the look of a man who wanted a word with someone who could make things happen. Turns out he found Judge Collins. They spoke just out of earshot, tucked into the alcove near Chambers, but I caught enough of Doyle's posture to know he wasn't asking for mercy. He leaned in, shoulders squared, gesturing toward the courtroom like Marcus was a live grenade that needed defusing. Dangerous man like that. "You don't drag this out," Judge Doyle said, his voice low but edged. "The longer he's in here, the more chance something goes sideways. Let's cut the nonsense and get him processed." Collins didn't exactly agree, but he didn't argue either. His lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes narrowing just slightly, the kind of expression that said he was at least willing to let Doyle keep pushing. And that was all Doyle needed. Permission without a paper trail. Back in the hallway, Rachel's phone buzzed. She stepped aside, frowning as she read the message. No name, no number, just 5 words. "They're coming. Hold your ground." Her pulse quickened. She glanced at Marcus, who was still standing where she'd left him, arms loose at his sides, expression unreadable. She didn't tell him about the text. Not yet. Then Doyle came back in. And he didn't just walk into the courtroom, he prowled. You could see it in the set of his shoulders, the tilt of his chin. He was the kind of man who believed that if you pressed hard enough, even steel would bend. He stopped right next to Marcus, close enough that the space between them was nothing but shared breath. His voice dropped to that tone meant for maximum venom, figures he muttered loud enough for the front row to hear, another loud-mouthed black man who thinks the world owes him something. "Let me tell you, boy," a couple of people in the gallery stiffened. One man turned his head sharply, ready to intervene if things got physical. Marcus didn't move, didn't blink. People like you end up exactly where they belong, in chains, or in the ground. The air shifted. You could feel it like the moment before a thunderclap when the whole world holds its breath. Doyle was waiting for him to explode, waiting for an outburst he could spin into proof that Marcus was a threat. But Marcus just tilted his head slowly. His voice was low, steady, and so calm it cut deeper than a shout ever could. "Your time's almost up." It wasn't a threat. Not exactly. It was a statement. The kind you say when you already know how the next few minutes will play out. For the first time that day, Doyle's smirk faltered. Just a flicker, but it was there, a split-second crack in the armor. He covered it with a scoff, straightening up and stepping back. But I saw it, and so did Rachel, and maybe even Collins, who was watching from the bench with a frown that wasn't there before. The bailiff announced for everyone to take their seats. People shuffled back into place, the scrape of chairs echoing against the paneled walls. Rachel sat down, her eyes flicking between Doyle Collins and Marcus. That text still burned in her mind. "They're coming." Ethan adjusted his camera ready for whatever was about to happen. Paul Jenkins slid into his seat near the back, his phone still in hand, his thumb moving like he was sending coordinates to someone who was already close. Marcus eased back into his chair at the defense table, posture loose, but gaze steady. Doyle, on the other hand, stayed standing for a moment too long, like he wanted one last angle to play. But whatever advantage he thought he had, it was slipping. Because here's the thing, you could almost feel the change in the room. It wasn't just tension anymore, it was anticipation. Like everyone, even the ones who had no idea why, sensed something was coming. And Marcus. He didn't just sense it. He was waiting for it. It started with a sound most people in that courtroom had never heard in their lives, the deep, throaty growl of a military SUV engine idling just beyond the courthouse gates. At first, no one paid much attention. The trial was still in recess, and the low hum was just background noise against the murmur of the crowd. But then came the sharp click of multiple doors opening, followed by the heavy, synchronized thud of boots hitting pavement. Not the shuffle of courthouse security. No, this was different. Precise. Measured. People began shifting in their seats, glancing toward the tall windows. Even Judge Collins leaned slightly, trying to catch a glimpse past the blinds. Then the front doors swung open. 4 men strode in their uniforms. Not the crisp blues of local police, but deep navy with gold insignia stitched into the shoulders. Special operations dress, the kind you didn't wear unless you'd earned it through decades of service. Their steps were deliberate, their eyes scanning the room in quick, sweeping arcs. Not a word was spoken, but the message was clear: they weren't here to watch. Rachel's breath caught. Ethan lowered his camera for the first time all day. Doyle moved before anyone else could, stepping into their path with a hand raised, like he had any authority here. "You can't just walk in here," he barked, his voice echoing harder than he meant it to. The man at the front didn't even slow down. He brushed past Doyle's outstretched arm like it wasn't there, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the deputy. And that's when I saw him, the one every eye would remember later. Admiral James Rowan. Even out of uniform, his presence would have commanded the room. But in full-dress whites, with the burnished rows of service ribbons, and the hard lines of a man who'd spent a lifetime giving orders under fire, there was no mistaking who he was. His voice cut through the air like a well-aimed round. "Where's Marcus Hale?" The gallery froze. You could almost hear the collective question hanging there. Why is a 4-star admiral looking for a man on trial? Marcus didn't move at first. He sat perfectly still, letting the weight of that question settle over the room. Then slowly he stood. His eyes met Rowan's, and for a moment there was nothing else. No courtroom, no judge, no Doyle. Just the quiet lock of recognition between 2 men who knew exactly who the other was. Rowan's expression shifted just slightly into something you almost never saw on a man like him: respect. Not the polite kind. The kind born from history, from trust, forged somewhere far away from the polished wood and gavel in front of us. Marcus gave a single nod. Rowan returned it. No handshake, no embrace. They didn't need it. That was when the room truly changed. You could feel it, a silent ripple that moved from the front row to the very back. Even those who had no clue what was happening could tell the balance of power had just tipped, and it wasn't in Doyle's favor anymore. Collins cleared his throat, the sound strangely tight. "Admiral Rowan, I know exactly where I am," Judge Rowan interrupted without looking away from Marcus. "And I'm not here to play politics." Someone in the back whispered, "What the hell is going on?" Another person muttered, "I told you he wasn't just some guy." Doyle tried again, his tone sharp. "Sir, with all due respect." But Rowan turned his head just enough for his eyes to meet Doyle's, and the words died in Doyle's throat. It wasn't a glare. It was worse, the kind of measured, unimpressed stare that told you you'd already said too much. Rachel glanced at Paul Jenkins, who was watching the entire scene like a man who'd just won a bet he'd been holding on to for years. Paul's phone lit up in his hand. 2 words: "They're here." Outside, another SUV door shut. More footsteps approached. Inside, though, no one moved. No one even breathed too loudly. Because whether they understood the specifics or not, everyone in that room knew one thing. Something big had just walked in, and it was about to change everything. Marcus didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just stood there, steady as stone, like this was exactly how it was supposed to unfold. And for the first time since the morning started, It wasn't Doyle running the show anymore. For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension from Admiral Rowan's entrance still hung in the air like a storm about to break. Then, without asking permission, Rowan stepped forward, boots striking the floor with a weight that made people sit straighter. He stopped at Judge Collins's bench, placing a flat leather case on top. The sound was soft, but it landed like a hammer. "Your Honor," Rowan said, voice steady but edged with command. "This must be entered into the record immediately." Collins eyed the case, suspicion flickering across his face. "And what exactly is this declassified just hours ago?" Rowan replied, locking eyes with him. "Department of Defense authorization. For you, and you alone." Collins hesitated, glancing toward Doyle as if seeking silent backup. Then curiosity, or maybe unease, pushed him forward. He opened the folder. At first, his expression barely shifted, but as his eyes scanned line after line, the mask cracked. His lips parted slightly, his brows pulled together, and finally, a faint tremor in his hand betrayed him. Rowan turned toward the room, his voice filling every corner. "You've been told this man is the defendant, Marcus Hale, but that's not the truth, not all of it." The gallery leaned forward almost in unison. Doyle folded his arms, trying to look bored, but his jaw had tightened. Marcus Hale Rowan continued, is a decorated Navy SEAL. The man who led one of the most dangerous hostage rescues in recent history, an operation spanning 3 countries deep in hostile territory. He went in with 6 men. He came out with every single hostage alive, 23 souls, not one left behind. A sharp gasp echoed from the back row. Rachel's fingers curled over the bench knuckles, white. Ethan's camera shook slightly in his hands. "Most of you have never heard of it," Rowan said, "because the mission's records were sealed, wiped from public view to protect him from the terrorists still hunting him. He's not just a veteran, he's a man who's still serving this country in ways most of us can't begin to imagine." Collins's eyes darted from the file to Marcus, then back again. "And right now," Rowan went on, "Marcus Hale is a protected witness in a federal investigation tied directly to national security. His safety isn't a courtesy, it's the law. Any harm against him is a federal offense." The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Doyle's smirk faltered. His face went pale. Because suddenly that kick he'd thrown earlier wasn't just misconduct, it was assaulting a federally protected Navy SEAL. That could end careers. That could end lives as he knew them. Collins shifted in his seat, his gavel hand twitching. "Admiral, are you saying I'm saying," Rowan cut in, voice sharp as a blade, "that the Department of Defense is now fully aware of how Mr. Hale has been treated in this courtroom? And I will personally see to it that every action taken against him today is reviewed by the U.S. Attorney's Office. This ends now." The room erupted in whispers. Paul Jenkins sat back, a faint, knowing smile on his lips, like he'd been waiting for this very moment. Rachel turned to Marcus, eyes wide, but he stood unmoving, calm, composed, the faintest glint in his gaze. Doyle, still rooted to his spot, muttered under his breath, "This is ridiculous." Marcus's head turned slowly toward him. "I told you," he said quietly, his voice low but carrying, "your time's almost up." For the first time all day, Doyle didn't have an answer. He swallowed hard and looked away. Collins cleared his throat, but the authority in his voice was gone. "Given these revelations, the court will adjust proceedings accordingly." His words felt forced, dragged out of him like he'd rather choke on them than say them aloud. Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, typed fast. "We have a bombshell. Publish immediately." Up at the bench, Rowan gathered his folder with military precision. "We're not here to disrupt justice, Your Honor," he said evenly. "We're here to make sure it's actually served." No one argued. No one even breathed too loudly. And in the center of it all, Marcus Hale, once just another defendant in chains, now stood as the calm eye of a hurricane that had turned the entire room inside out. It happened so fast, most people didn't realize what was going on until the sound of heavy boots hit the courtroom floor. Two military police officers in crisp uniforms stepped inside the glint of brass on their caps, catching the light. In one of their hands was a folded document with a red seal. They didn't ask for permission. They walked straight to Admiral Rowan and handed it over. Rowan turned toward Judge Collins, his voice steady but cutting through the air. Your Honor. By order of the United States Department of Justice, and under federal statute, we are here to execute an arrest warrant for Officer Thomas Doyle. He paused just long enough for every head in the room to turn toward the man for assaulting a federally protected witness. The words hit like a gunshot. Doyle blinked as if he hadn't heard right. Then, with a scoff, he stepped back from the table. You've got to be kidding me. The military police didn't smile. Sir, stand up. I'm not going anywhere. Doyle snapped, his voice rising. You don't walk into my courtroom. This isn't your courtroom. Rowan interrupted, his tone dropping lower, colder. It's the people's courtroom, and you just violated the very law you swore to uphold. The MPs moved in. Doyle jerked his arm back, but they were faster. In a blur, one gripped his wrist, the other took his shoulder, and within seconds the metallic click of handcuffs rang out. Gasps rippled through the room. Rachel's hand flew to her mouth. Paul Jenkins leaned forward, eyebrows raised as if he couldn't believe he was actually seeing this. Judge Collins stared down at his bench, his fingers tightening on the edge of the wood. Doyle kept twisting his face, flushed red. You can't do this. I'll have every one of you. That's when Marcus stood. The shuffle of his chair was the only sound for a moment. He turned toward Doyle, meeting his eyes with a calm so sharp it felt dangerous. His voice was low, deliberate, every word a nail in the coffin. You thought you were above the law? Marcus said, not looking away for even a heartbeat. Turns out, the law was above you all along. It was quiet enough to hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. No one moved. No one spoke. Doyle froze for half a second, just long enough for everyone to see the truth settle on his face before the MPs guided him toward the door. His boots scraped against the floor as if even gravity was pushing him out. When the heavy doors closed behind them, the silence in the room felt almost holy. Judge Collins's eyes flickered toward Marcus, but he didn't say a word. Instead, he looked down the weight of what had just happened, pressing his gaze to the desk in front of him. His gavel sat untouched. Rachel, sitting just behind Marcus, exhaled slowly. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, small, restrained, but carrying the quiet triumph of someone who'd just seen justice take its first real step. And Marcus. He simply sat back down, the faintest shadow of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The storm had shifted, and everyone in that room knew nothing about this case would ever be the same again. The courtroom doors swung open and the hallway exploded into chaos. Reporters surged forward, their voices overlapping into a frantic wall of sound. Questions were hurled from every direction, sharp, urgent, hungry. Mr. Hale, do you have a statement? Is it true you were part of the Navy SEALs, officer? Doyle, was he targeting you because of your race? Camera shutters fired in rapid bursts, their flashes strobing across Marcus's face. The air smelled of coffee paper and the faint ozone tang from overheated camera lights. Marcus didn't rush. He stepped forward with measured strides, Admiral Rowan just half a pace behind him, the quiet weight of authority in every movement. He didn't shield his eyes from the cameras, didn't duck his head. Instead, he gave a small, steady smile, not of victory, but of resolve. A young reporter shoved her mic toward him. What do you want people to take away from what happened in there? Marcus paused for just a moment. His gaze moved over the crowd, the faces pressed in tight, the pens poised above notebooks. That doing the right thing, he said quietly, isn't about what's easy. It's about what's necessary. He didn't wait for the follow-up. Rowan guided him through the press, the MPs clearing a narrow path toward the waiting black SUV idling at the curb. The door opened and Marcus climbed in. Rowan followed, closing it with a solid final thud that seemed to shut out all the noise from outside. From the courthouse steps, Ethan stood with his laptop bag slung over his shoulder. He had stayed silent during the press frenzy, his eyes following Marcus until the SUV began to pull away. He glanced down at his laptop screen where the headline draft still glowed. He didn't type another word. Instead, he closed it gently, almost ceremonially, and thought, "This isn't just a story. It's a reminder." The SUV rolled forward, sliding into the flow of traffic. Inside, Rowan leaned back, his eyes fixed ahead while Marcus turned toward the window. The city blurred past in streaks of gray and gold, the afternoon light catching on the glass. Marcus's reflection stared back at him, older than the man in the photographs from his Navy days, maybe a little more tired but steady. His gaze drifted past his own image to the streets outside. People walked, talked, lived their lives without knowing what had just shifted in that courthouse. And maybe that was the way it should be. He didn't need applause. He didn't need headlines. He just needed to know that for today, at least, justice had found its way to the surface. The SUV turned a corner and the courthouse vanished from view. And in that quiet moment, with the hum of the engine beneath him and the faint sound of the city beyond the glass, Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Justice, he thought, isn't only written in the law. It's carried by the people willing to stand for what's right, no matter the cost. Sometimes a story isn't just about what happened, it's about what it leaves behind. Today's chapter reminded us that justice isn't only about laws and courtrooms. It's about courage, truth, and the quiet strength to stand your ground when it matters most. If this story spoke to you, take a moment to hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more powerful, meaningful tales. Your support isn't just a number. It's the reason our team can keep bringing you stories that move hearts and open minds. At Mr. Mac's Stories, we believe every voice matters, every truth deserves to be heard, and every listener is part of the journey. That's our mark, our signature, and with you here, it's a mark that lasts.